The Cold War, a complex struggle of ideologies, power, and influence. The Cold War, 1947 to 1991, was one of the most significant geopolitical events of the 20th century, characterized by intense rivalry between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Unlike the global wars that preceded it, the Cold War did not feature a direct military conflict between the two dominant nations. Instead, it unfolded through proxy wars, nuclear arms races, espionage, economic competition, and a battle for ideological supremacy. This period shaped global politics, economics, culture, and technology, with echoes still felt today. Origins of the Cold War. The roots of the Cold War lay in the aftermath of World War II, when the once united front of the Allied powers began to unravel. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged from the war as the world's two most powerful nations. Still, their visions for the future of Europe and the world were starkly different. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union ought to expand its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It established communist regimes in countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, ensuring that these nations remained loyal to Moscow. The United States, under President Harry Truman, viewed Soviet expansionism as a direct threat to the principles of democracy and free market capitalism. The U.S. believed in the necessity of containing communism, which led to the formulation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, stating that America would support nations resisting communist subjugation. The ideological conflict between the capitalist West, led by the U.S., and the communist East, led by the USSR, set the stage for the Cold War. The division of Europe, the Iron Curtain. The term Iron Curtain, popularized by Winston Churchill in his famous 1946 speech, referred to the metaphorical and physical boundary that divided Europe into two political blocs. On one side were the Western democracies of Europe, backed by the United States and its NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, allies, and on the other side, the communist states of Eastern Europe, aligned with the Soviet Union through the Warsaw Pact. Germany became the most prominent symbol of this division. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, the country was divided into four occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, located deep within the Soviet zone, was also split into East and West. Tensions over the status of Berlin would become one of the defining features of the Cold War, culminating in the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. The wall, built by the East German government to prevent its citizens from fleeing to the West, stood as a stark reminder of the ideological and physical divisions of the Cold War. The nuclear arms race and MAD. One of the most dangerous aspects of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending the U.S. monopoly on nuclear weapons. This development triggered a frantic race between the two superpowers to build ever more powerful and sophisticated nuclear arsenals. By the 1950s, both the US and the Soviet Union had developed hydrogen bombs, which were significantly more destructive than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world now faced the terrifying prospect of total annihilation. The policy of mutually assured destruction, MAD, emerged as a deterrent against nuclear war. The logic of MAD was simple. Neither side would launch a nuclear strike, because doing so would ensure their destruction. Despite the chilling logic of MAD, the world came perilously close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. When the Soviet Union began installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, the U.S. responded by imposing a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world held its breath as the two superpowers stood on the brink of nuclear war. Ultimately, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba, and the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey. Proxy wars and the global struggle. Although the Cold War did not result in direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, both powers engaged in a series of proxy wars around the world. These conflicts were fought in distant lands, but had global implications, as each side sought to extend its influence by supporting opposing factions in local disputes. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953. One of the first major conflicts of the Cold War was the Korean War. Following World War II, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel into two zones: the Communist North, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the capitalist South, backed by the United States and its allies. In 1950, North Korean forces, with the encouragement of the Soviet Union, invaded the South. This led to a US-led United Nations intervention, pushing the North Koreans back. The conflict was seesawed for 3 years, with neither side able to achieve a decisive victory. The war ended in 1953 with an armistice, but the Korean peninsula remains divided to this day, with tensions still simmering between the North and South. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. The Vietnam War was perhaps the most contentious and devastating of the Cold War proxy conflicts. After the defeat of French colonial forces in 1954, Vietnam was divided into a communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and a non-communist South, supported by the United States. The U.S. feared that the fall of South Vietnam would lead to a domino effect of communist takeovers throughout Southeast Asia. In an attempt to prevent this, the U.S. sent military advisors to South Vietnam in the late 1950s, escalating its involvement into a full-scale military commitment by the mid-1960s. The war, which became deeply unpopular in the U.S., cost the lives of over 58,000 American soldiers and millions of Vietnamese. The U.S. eventually withdrew its forces in 1973, and by 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, uniting the country under communist rule. The Soviet-Afghan War, 1979 to 1989. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union became embroiled in its version of Vietnam, the Soviet-Afghan War. In 1979, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan to prop up a faltering communist government facing an insurgency from Mujahideen fighters. The United States, along with other countries, supplied the Mujahideen with weapons, training, and financial support to bleed the Soviet Union dry. The war dragged on for a decade, taking a significant toll on Soviet resources and morale. The Mujahideen, bolstered by U.S. support and fighting in the rugged Afghan terrain, were able to resist Soviet occupation. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew, marking a major defeat for Moscow and contributing to the internal pressures that would soon lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Espionage and intelligence, the secret war. Beyond proxy wars and nuclear tensions, the Cold War was also fought in the shadows through espionage and intelligence-gathering operations. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union developed vast intelligence networks, led by agencies like the American CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and the Soviet KGB, Committee for State Security. Espionage took many forms during the Cold War, from covert operations aimed at toppling unfriendly regimes to more traditional spying activities like gathering military and technological secrets. Famous Cold War spies, such as Kim Philby and Aldrich Ames, were able to infiltrate high levels of government, passing valuable information to the opposing side. The Berlin Tunnel, Operation Gold, and U-2 spy plane incidents were just two high-profile examples of the lengths both sides went to gather intelligence. One of the most notorious episodes of espionage during the Cold War occurred in the U.S. in the 1950s. The trial and execution of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, accused of passing atomic secrets to the Soviets, highlighted the deep paranoia surrounding communism in America. The Red Scare and Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist crusade led to widespread fear, suspicion, and the blacklisting of individuals suspected of communist sympathies. The space race, competition beyond the Earth. While much of the Cold War was marked by conflict, one of its more positive outcomes was the acceleration of scientific and technological advancements, particularly in the realm of space exploration. The space race, as it became known, was a competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union to achieve dominance in space exploration. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, into orbit, shocking the world and setting off a wave of anxiety in the United States. In response, the U.S. invested heavily in science education and space technology, leading to the creation of NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The space race culminated in the U.S. Apollo program, which landed astronauts on the moon in 1969. A symbolic victory for American technological prowess. Although the space race was fueled by Cold War competition, it also led to remarkable advancements in fields like satellite technology, telecommunications, and materials science. The legacy of the space race is still felt today, with space exploration continuing to push the boundaries of human achievement. The Cold War's end and the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was facing a series of internal crises that would eventually lead to its downfall. The Soviet economy was stagnant, burdened by the costs of maintaining its vast military apparatus and propping up its satellite states. Additionally, growing discontent within the Eastern Bloc led to a wave of protests and movements for greater freedom and reform. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and introduced a series of reforms known as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. These reforms aimed to address the country's economic and political problems, but they also unleashed forces that Gorbachev could not control. Nationalist movements within the Soviet republics gained momentum, and the Berlin Wall, long the symbol of Cold War division, fell in 1989. In December 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved, marking the end of the Cold War. The United States emerged as the world's sole superpower, and the post-Cold War world ushered in new geopolitical dynamics. If you found value in this video, please give it a thumbs up, like, and subscribe to support this channel. Please share across social media platforms to reach a wider audience. Legacy of the Cold War. Although the Cold War ended more than 3 decades ago, its legacy continues to shape global politics and relations. The nuclear arms treaties negotiated during the Cold War, such as the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START, remain critical to efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation. The rivalry between Russia and the West, though no longer framed in terms of communism versus capitalism, persists in the form of conflicts over NATO expansion, cyber warfare, and territorial disputes. Moreover, the Cold War set the stage for many of the conflicts and power dynamics that define the modern world. From the continuing division of Korea to the geopolitical struggles in the Middle East, many of the tensions that shaped the Cold War era remain relevant today. The Cold War was not just a struggle between two nations, but a complex global conflict that affected virtually every corner of the world. It was a battle of ideologies, economies, technologies, and cultures, and its impact continues to be felt across the globe. What were the long-term effects of the Cold War on global politics, economics, culture, and technology? The Cold War profoundly shaped the modern world, with far-reaching effects on global politics, economics, culture, and technology that continue to influence current events. 1. Global politics. The Cold War left a legacy of alliances, institutions, and rivalries that persist today. Some of the long-term political effects include formation of global alliances. NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact emerged as military alliances during the Cold War. While the Warsaw Pact dissolved after the Soviet Union's collapse, NATO continues to play a significant role in global security. The alliance has expanded to include many former Eastern Bloc countries, which has led to ongoing tensions with Russia. Bipolar world to unipolar, multipolar world. The Cold War established a bipolar world, where global power was concentrated among two superpowers. After the Cold War, the US emerged as the world's sole superpower. But recent years have seen the rise of a multipolar world with countries like China, Russia, and India exerting greater influence. Proxy wars and regional conflicts. The Cold War left a legacy of regional conflicts and divisions. Countries like Korea and Vietnam remain divided or affected by Cold War-era conflicts. Many African, Middle Eastern, and Latin American nations experienced proxy wars and political instability due to superpower interventions, with ongoing repercussions today. Nuclear non-proliferation. The Cold War. Arms race between the US and the Soviet Union led to the development of treaties like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and arms control agreements. Example START. The efforts to prevent nuclear proliferation and control the spread of weapons of mass destruction remain a crucial part of global politics. 2. Economics. The Cold War created an economic divide between the capitalist and communist worlds, with lasting effects on global trade, development, and economic policy. Economic globalization. The end of the Cold War accelerated economic globalization as former communist states opened their markets to the global economy. Countries like China, which reformed its economy in the late stages of the Cold War, became major players in global trade. Neoliberal economic policies. The triumph of capitalism and the end of the Cold War led to the spread of neoliberal economic policies, including free markets, deregulation, and privatization. Institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank promoted these policies, which have shaped global economic development. Economic integration of Eastern Europe. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many Eastern European nations transitioned to market economies and integrated into the European Union, benefiting from economic reforms and foreign investment. However, this transition was difficult for some nations, leading to economic disparities. 3. Cultural impact. The Cold War influenced global culture in ways that are still evident today. Cultural exchange and competition. During the Cold War, both the US and the Soviet Union used cultural diplomacy to promote their ideologies. The US promoted jazz, Hollywood films, and consumer culture, while the Soviet Union emphasized its achievements in space exploration and the arts. This cultural competition helped shape global pop culture and media and propaganda. The Cold War intensified the use of media as a tool for propaganda, with both sides using television, radio, like Voice of America, and print media to promote their ideologies. The legacy of media as a powerful tool for influencing public opinion remains strong today. Cold War. Nostalgia. In former Eastern Bloc countries, there is sometimes nostalgia for aspects of life under communism, such as social security and stability. Meanwhile, in the West, the Cold War period is often romanticized in pop culture, including films, books, and TV shows that explore Cold War espionage, conflicts, and politics. 4. Technological advancements. The Cold War spurred significant technological advancements, particularly in military and space exploration, which continue to shape modern science and industry. Space exploration. The space race between the US and the Soviet Union led to groundbreaking achievements, such as the moon landing and the development of satellite technology. Space exploration continues to be a major field of scientific innovation, with private companies like SpaceX building on Cold War-era technologies. Military technology. The Cold War drove the development of advanced military technologies, including jet aircraft, missile systems, and nuclear submarines. Many of these innovations laid the groundwork for modern defense systems and civilian technologies, such as GPS, which emerged from Cold War military research. Information technology. The Cold War played a role in the development of computing and telecommunications technologies. The need for advanced surveillance and communication systems led to the creation of early computers, and Cold War-era funding for research in fields like cryptography has had a lasting impact on cybersecurity and modern computing. How did the Cuban Missile Crisis impact the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union in the long term? The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was a pivotal moment in the Cold War, bringing the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. Its resolution had profound long-term effects on their relationship, as both sides took steps to avoid similar confrontations in the future. Key long-term impacts include: 1. A new era of diplomacy. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both the US and the Soviet Union recognized the need for direct communication and more effective diplomatic channels to prevent misunderstandings that could lead to conflict. Establishment of the hotline. In the immediate aftermath of the crisis, a direct communication line, commonly known as the Moscow-Washington hotline, was established between the White House and the Kremlin. This telephone link allowed for real-time communication between the leaders of both countries, reducing the risk of future miscalculations or delays in communication. Improved diplomatic relations. Although the Cold War continued, the Cuban Missile Crisis marked the beginning of a more cautious approach to superpower relations. The US and the Soviet Union engaged in arms control negotiations and reached agreements that helped to reduce the likelihood of nuclear conflict. 2. Arms control agreements. The Cuban Missile Crisis directly contributed to a series of arms control agreements that aimed to reduce the threat of nuclear war. And Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1963. Signed in the year following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Partial Test Ban Treaty prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. This was one of the first major arms control agreements between the superpowers, signaling a shift towards managing the nuclear arms race more responsibly. Nuclear non-proliferation efforts. The lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis underscored the need for broader efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Subsequent treaties, such as the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, in 1968, sought to limit the number of nuclear-armed states and promote disarmament. 3. The doctrine of mutual restraint. Both the US and the Soviet Union became more cautious about provoking direct military confrontations after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This restraint was driven by the recognition that any escalation between the superpowers could spiral into a nuclear conflict. Mutually assured destruction, MAD. The Cuban Missile Crisis reinforced the concept of mutually assured destruction, which became the foundation of nuclear strategy during the Cold War. Both superpowers realized that a full-scale nuclear war would be catastrophic for both sides, leading to a shared understanding that nuclear weapons should only be used as a last resort. Shift in proxy wars. While the US and the Soviet Union avoided direct conflict, the Cold War continued to play out in proxy wars around the world. However, the Cuban Missile Crisis likely contributed to a more measured approach to these conflicts, as both sides were wary of any situation that could escalate into a superpower confrontation. 4. Long-term trust and cooperation. Despite the continued rivalry, the Cuban Missile Crisis marked the beginning of a cautious and limited form of cooperation between the US and the Soviet Union. And détente, 1970s. The period of détente in the 1970s, which saw improved relations between the US and the Soviet Union, can be partially traced back to the lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Leaders like US President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev worked to ease tensions through diplomacy, arms control agreements, such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks or SALT, and cultural exchanges. Collaborative efforts. The crisis also contributed to a series of collaborative efforts in science, technology, and space exploration. For instance, the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975, where American and Soviet astronauts worked together in space, symbolized a thaw in Cold War tensions and demonstrated the potential for peaceful cooperation. In conclusion, the Cuban Missile Crisis left a lasting legacy on US-Soviet relations, fostering a more cautious approach to diplomacy, a recognition of the dangers of nuclear escalation, and a series of arms control measures that helped reduce the risk of global catastrophe. Although the Cold War continued for nearly 3 more decades, the crisis marked a turning point in how both superpowers approached their rivalry. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up, like and subscribe to our channel for more self-improvement videos. Comment below to tell us how useful you found this video. Remember to share on various social media platforms to reach a wider audience. Click the notification bell to get notified anytime we post a new video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.